Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I am Andrea Carey. This morning I have missed the point to change my name on the presentation. So just know this is Andrea Carey coming to you from the North Carolina Coalition Ed Homelessness. And yeah, so it is May 2021, and we are going to get started with our viewing just the agenda today for our Durham HMIS users meeting. We've got a pretty to the point agenda today, so just a couple of updates to go over, new resource for you. And then we wanted to take a step back and talk through a couple of the kind of fundamental building blocks of the HMIS workflow, project start date, and housing move-in date, and offer some additional TA for those data elements, those stages. And then we can look ahead at the calendar. So if there's anything that you would like to ask about, to run through, have a demo of, please do let us know. You can use the chat box, or we'll open it up at the end as well for any of your questions. All right, so just to get us kind of up and started today, let's go over these system updates. First up, we've got just a new resource for you about the history color bar. We've talked about this a little bit in terms of corrections for federal reporting and how you can dive into the history of responses in HMIS to review what's been entered before and even make corrections on that if needed. And so this history bar will allow you, within your visibility, it is limited to your visibility, but you can see those past responses and kind of excavate those layers of potential entries from clients. And then you can also make corrections. So if there's something that was inaccurate, you can see where that exactly was and either correct it or do what you need to do depending on the situation. So we do have the guide up and posted on our training and knowledge page. That direct website is ncceh.org/HMIS/training. In the guide, it's going to show you some of what we've talked about kind of in bits and pieces, but it really goes over how to find the history color bar, when to use it, what to use it for, and then how you can make corrections based off of it. And so that's a great desk guide for you to look at as you're maybe reviewing data, maybe you're running that weekly or monthly report and you have questions about a response. This can help you uncover the reason why you're seeing a certain response for a client. Any questions about that guide?
Yes.
Yes, great.
Okay, so sometimes when I click on the history bar, it gives me the option to delete an entry, and then other times it won't. Is there any particular reason why sometimes we can't delete an entry that we know was not accurate?
Yeah, there sure is. So I'm just going to pull this up here. So on our training and knowledge page, if you scroll down to other resources and guides, this is actually under the advanced section, advanced tools. We're trying to build that out. And the reason that sometimes you can see you have different actions that you can take with a previously entered response is because of ROI, EDA mode. So you want to, just going to scroll through here. I think we've got something here. So when that pops up, it's going to, that history box is going to show you a potential action, that trash bin, but only for the responses that were entered using your current EDA mode. So if your EDA mode matches the provider padding, then you have the opportunity to remove it. Remember, there's no undo. So that's like a final sort of trashing of that response. It also shows you the value and the ROI status. So the folder there with the green check means that there's an ROI that's active for this EDA mode. But you'll notice there wasn't for this other response, even though I think there was. It's just we couldn't see it because we were using our EDA mode. Yeah, so a great question. It's really determined by enter data as mode.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions for us before we keep going? Okay, let's go. So big news on something we've been talking about for many, many months now, many moons. The point-in-time count and housing inventory count. We have submitted that. It is complete. So really appreciate your everyone's help on the call for getting this submitted, reviewing those corrections, and helping us pull that all together. And so, yeah, that was submitted for our PIT night of January 27th, and that included our sheltered projects from the HMIS side. We also submitted, or Lloyd prepared and submitted the unsheltered count as well. So that is submitted, that is complete. So now we can look forward to other uses for the data. Actually, we can now use this data that we had submitted. So we'll talk more about that in a future meeting. What was the data that was submitted? What does it maybe say about our community right now? Absolutely. And I do want to acknowledge too that this PIT and HIC came after kind of back-to-back federal reporting. We started off last year with September for the LSA, longitudinal system analysis, then went straight into system performance measures, and then straight into PIT. So I know that was a lot. We've definitely given that feedback to HUD. They have heard a lot about that as well. And we're really workshopping some things to try to make that less of a burden in future years. All right, let's,
Andrea,
are there any questions? Yeah, Lloyd, go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Again, I wanted to add, since you referenced the count and HIC, if anyone needs information about the numbers, I have prepared a PowerPoint overview that I'm happy to share. I think we're still working within the department maybe to get it posted to the DurhamCoC.org website. I'm not sure how long that's going to take, but if anybody wants that PowerPoint and has not yet received it, please feel free to reach out to me. Our overall count was 396 people on January 27th being homeless. That included 118 unsheltered people, and the rest were in shelter or transitional housing. Thanks.
Lloyd, can you send that to me, please? Or everyone?
Please send an email request. I believe I did. I may have sent it to the SED group, but send me an email request, please, and I'm happy to get it to you. It just helps my failing memory to have that record.
Awesome. All right, and I think you also said, Lloyd, that it's in the process of being posted somewhere publicly too on the CoC site. But
we
that
hope
might
so.
take another.
Continuing to work with Ruby, our webmaster, on that point.
Cool. All right. Well, yeah, so it's a lot of work. We go really in depth, person by person, for this data every year, and just want to, express gratitude for that, and also, the acknowledgement and gratitude for your diligence every day of the year, right? That this is one night of the year that we work to submit, but we also are submitting annual data from HMIS to HUD on a yearly basis. So it's important every day. Awesome, thanks. All right, let's keep going. Now, before this next part, I have just a little silly question for you. Let's get kind of into using our Zoom tools. I didn't do this one yet, right? Okay, so this is just to get us familiar with the polling technology here. What is the best kind of pickle? Just want to use stretch our Zoom muscles here on this Thursday morning. All right, I'm seeing a lot of initial reactions. Some of us are thinking about it. I'll give you another second to submit, and then we'll end it. Okay. All right. So our results, a lot of consensus in this group, which I really like. We've got dill pickle folks here, and no one selected you, which I'm also a little bit pleased about as a fan of this condiment. Yes. Well, I know this is a very controversial question. We'll appreciate stretching those muscles, our Zoom skills here, and good to see that about our group. I appreciate the bread and butter too, just by the way, for that person. I'm not picking on you. I think it's great. It has their place. Oh, yes. All right, we've got quite the conversation going. So we are also moving into our next section, how can we help? Just a little bit of a refresher on some things, and really wanted to focus in on the fundamental question for our HMIS data: when does enrollment start? This is key because everything else is based on, when the enrollment starts for our data. So let's do a quick review of this and some examples. So this is our data collection stage of project start, and this is where most of our data elements are collected. The entry assessment, also known as the intake, really establishes that client's initial status. What's their context, what's their situation when you start serving them. And this is, we'll say this is important for all clients. We don't just measure enrollments for, by household, we're doing it by client. So we're really looking at start dates for your heads of households, your adults, and your children. Everyone gets included here. And just as a note on this collection is that once data is collected at project start, data changes shouldn't really be collected or entered on this entry assessment, but through an update or an annual. Now, of course, there may be corrections that you need to go back to the intake, but any changes, any kind of real changes from the first day you serve the client should be recorded on an update or an annual assessment. And is there a question? Yep, okay. All right, so in terms of what this is really looking at, the start date in particular is determining the beginning of a client's participation in a project, and this is their snapshot. So think of it as a little Polaroid without, Photoshop available, right? We're just trying to take a snapshot of that moment in time for the client, really reflecting that client status on day one. And the other thing to note is that this is a little bit different for different project types. With your core services differing between project types, the start date actually differs a little bit too. So let's take a look at those differences and make sure that that we all understand it. I think it's, you may hopefully feel really comfortable with what your project type start date is, but it's also important as we're doing more and more coordination and collaboration of services that you understand the other project type start dates as well. So first off, we've got street outreach, kind of our first project type. And this is really looking at the first contact between client and outreach worker. So their services start when they meet. And that can be not necessarily a full intake, right? A street outreach has a really embodies the progressive engagement model in terms of data collection. You may be gathering some things over several contacts. Then for residential homeless projects like emergency shelter and transitional housing, the start date is the first night the client sleeps in a bed. The way I think about this is, when does your head hit the pillow, right? What, like, your core service as a residential homeless project is that sheltering overnight. And so that is what is going to measure when a client is being served by you, is that first night that they're sleeping there. For permanent housing projects, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, homeless prevention too, it's really the date that an eligible client accepts an offer of available services. So there's a couple key things there. Eligible clients, right? Accepting that off, like they're agreeing to it in some way, and their available services. And so this isn't permanent housing project starts shouldn't be when someone is like waiting for services to become available, right? It's when there's actually, an opening slot, funding available, services available, that you're going to have that start date. And this is also just, again, really about when those core services start, about finding permanent housing. And then all other project types like supportive services only or coordinated entry, kind of a subset of supportive services only projects. This is about, those services aren't determined by a night staying or, defined by that housing search or anything. So it's really just about when those services are first delivered to the client.
Andrea, could we come back to permanent housing and the date when an eligible client accepts an offer of available services? Just want to continue to break that open a bit, particularly in terms, I think, of rapid rehousing, where, a client may be eligible and they may be interested in accepting the offer, or they have accepted the offer, but rapid rehousing services are not available to them because the project or the CoC's projects are at maximum capacity for that particular month or that particular time period. So the client is really kind of in a queue waiting for rapid rehousing assistance. Mm-hmm. Therefore, as I understand this definition, the project start date really becomes the date that the services are first available to that client.
Right, exactly. So there's a difference. I think in that scenario, Lloyd, you might have the client on the binding list, and they're ready, right? Like they're document ready. They are eager, not just accepting, but eager, they're eligible. But if you can't serve them, then you're not fully enrolling them, right? And that project start date doesn't occur until then.
My suggestion would be changing the wording of that just a little bit to like the date when services are available to an eligible client. And I think fixes that.
Well, you really do have several things there going on. I mean, the services have to be available, and the client has to accept them, right?
Well, we're
I
not
don't
forcing
know.
people into housing, Lloyd, but.
Correct. But
Okay.
we're looking at kind of when the client, I don't know if there's a formal intake for like a rapid rehousing project when they maybe complete the rapid rehousing intake form, which indicates that the services are available and the client is accepting the offer. Are we doing that, or is it more informal?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a little more in. Oh, sorry, Ricky. What were you adding?
I was just answering Lloyd, but go. It's your presentation.
Yeah, a little more informal, right? Because the key thing here is that even if you have an eligible client and they don't want to work with you, then you don't have an enrollment, right? So that's the key part there. But yeah, I think permanent housing in particular has, one, it's gone through some changes in the last 5 years or so, right? And it's also it's a lot of coordination between the client, between maybe your finance office, and between the local coordinated entry process. So yep, it's a lot of things coming together.
Yeah, thanks. I just thought it was important to try to break that open a bit more. Thank you.
Absolutely, appreciate it. Well, so let's put this discussion to the test and see if we can walk through an example and really identify the correct project start date. So we'll use our example client Henrietta to illustrate some different scenarios for HMIS data collection and data entry. All right, so first off, we're going to go over start date for street outreach. So here's our example timeline for Henrietta. She has our outreach worker has made contact with her, first met her on the 1st of May, and was able to make a little bit of a connection and return a few days later with some medical supplies to kind of continue to talk to our client. 1 day later, there's an exchange of some hygiene products, so continuing to deliver some services to our client. And then on the 7th of May, on our fourth contact, there's actually an agreement with the client. There's a case plan agreed to, and she signs the ROI, like a key step there. So what is the correct project start date for our client? And there's a second question to this poll, which is what is the date of engagement then for this client? And that's a question that specifically street outreach projects have to identify. And so this is a little bit of a kind of a 1-2 question here. And just so you know, you can't submit your response until you answer both questions. Okay, they're coming in here. All right, we're going to give you a couple more seconds to submit. Need some more folks to go in there. And remember, we haven't actually talked about the second question, so we'll talk about it, but I want to give you a chance to figure that out. All right, so I'm going to close this now in a minute. And yes, so we did get that right. So for project start, and street outreach, the correct project start date is the first contact for street outreach. So that is not necessarily, that enrollment isn't going to necessarily result in permanent housing for someone, right? Like you're gonna meet quite a few people probably that, and some are going to accept your services, some folks aren't. And that's why street outreach has this data element called date of engagement. So this is really about when is this client kind of fully enrolled? And this is the point at which you're going to need to have that ROI signed, and you're going to need all of the intake questions completed. So data quality is actually not taken into account before the date of engagement. It's just as of the date of engagement, you've got to have all those start questions completed. And so if you're working with a client and they're not at a place to even talk about a series of questions, then you don't have a date of engagement yet, right? You're still working on that, on that relationship. Yeah.
The interest rate is higher, but I don't pay closing costs. I don't pay any fee. Yeah, she's right.
Sorry.
Yeah, I don't think that's
Stevie.
related.
Oh, Stevie, do you have a question? Okay. All
No,
right.
Sounded for a minute like CB was multitasking.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, great. Yeah, if we could mute ourselves, that would be great if you don't have a question. Let's see. Any other questions on street outreach?
I have a question. I don't know if there's anybody doing street outreach on the call. In terms of doing the HMIS data entry, in my mind, this suggests that the street outreach project or caseworker can start a client record in the HMIS at the point of first contact or immediately after the point of first contact, and record second and third contacts, and then enter the ROI and the case plan after the fourth contact. Is that correct in terms of the process for HMIS?
That's exactly right. You can build up to kind of that full intake and record those contacts. Yep, that's exactly right.
Excuse me. So the date of the ROI, does it need to go back to the first contact? No, fascinating. Because for us, if the ROI isn't dated, then it hides data, right? Right?
Well, I mean,
Interesting.
yeah. So for the date of engagement, that's when the ROI date should match. Mm-hmm. So, and you could have it before that potentially, like maybe you're building up to date of engagement, but usually someone isn't ready to talk through privacy and ROIs until they're engaged. Yeah. So it's different, right, than emergency shelter. And so, yeah, absolutely. Street outreach is a really important component of the system and works a little bit differently. Yep. All right, well, let's go to our residential homeless projects next and talk about when the start date would be for this client. So I'm going to launch this now. So with Henrietta, she's been working with her street outreach worker and actually requests shelter that next month, that following month, June 1st. But a bed's not immediately available, so it does take a couple days before she's able to access a bed on June 4th. And then the next day, she's able to meet with in-house case management and start developing that relationship. So the question is, what is the correct project start date for shelter? And I see lots of answers coming in. Submit that poll here, and we'll give you just another 5 seconds to submit that. Awesome. And done. Okay. Great. So yes, this is the winning answer here is correct. So when Henrietta sleeps in the bed is what that project start date is going to be. That's the core service of our shelter and transitional housing projects is that shelter overnight. And so that is the date when she should have that enrollment in HMIS. Yeah, any questions? Cool. All right, let's keep going then with our permanent housing projects. So we've talked through this a little bit, but let's look at this example in particular. Henrietta is she's in shelter. She's now has a referral to the project. She's able to get some documentation squared away the 1st of July, and then there's a community meeting, there's case conferencing, and that works out on the 5th. And then on the 8th, the first housing search meeting occurs. So at what point would the project start date be for our permanent housing projects like rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, and now to a greater extent, homeless prevention?
Clarifying
so what were the
question.
things?
Clarifying question. You say
Yeah.
accepted. Who's doing the accepting?
Yes. Is that the right answer? No. So the
No.
client and the agency.
Like, is the client accepting or is the program accepting? Because that's
both. Yeah.
both is happening. Okay.
Mm-hmm. So yeah. Mm-hmm. I think in this timeline, it was specifically the project because of the case conferencing. So that there was case conferencing, and this client was accepted. The client previously had an eligibility interview, and that part of that was the client accepting. All right, so I'm going to close it off. I don't know if that changes your answer, Ricky. All right, we've got, we need a couple more votes here, folks. Or maybe this is tricky. All right, we've talked about this maybe in too many different nuanced ways. So we are correct here. So the correct date is going to be our case conferencing or accepted date. And why? Because it's at that point that we have all the pieces we need. We've got that referral, we've got a sense of the eligibility, the client has participated in that eligibility conversation and accepted, and there's actually room because there was case conferencing and the project has accepted this new client, Henrietta. So that is exactly right. Let's go to another example here of permanent housing, just because sometimes it can feel a little bit different when there's multiple projects kind of being considered here. So I'm going to launch this. So Henrietta, she's sleeping at a shelter, and then 2 weeks later has a coordinated entry assessment conducted. And then the client accepts and can access rapid rehousing services on the 5th. And that's before a housing search meeting on the 8th. So that's the first time she's able to really get that housing search meeting with the permanent housing provider case manager. So this might seem a little more familiar, as our shelter clients do. In our community, the coordinated entry assessment is that BI-SPDA, and then continue from there. All right, so I'm going to close this off in 5 seconds. Okay, great. All right, and we are right again. So the coordinated entry assessment is an important part of the puzzle, right? But the client isn't actually enrolled in permanent housing projects until there's services that they can access. And so the assessment is a way to help the community and permanent housing projects figure out who's next on the list when an opening occurs, but it's not actually the beginning of that enrollment. So enrollment is when the client is accepted and can access those services. Excellent job. All right. And let me get my little circle there. Cool. Okay, and then finally, we're talking about all the other project types that we have, whether that's coordinated entry specifically or other supportive services only projects, SSO, supportive services only. What is the correct project start date? So Henrietta, she presents for some services, maybe gets a little snack, comes back the next day for a community kitchen meal, a larger meal, and then starts a budgeting class a little bit later in the next month. And a few weeks after that, on the 18th, she's actually able to access some utility assistance, so another some financial assistance from this supportive services only project. So what is the correct project start date for our client? Okay, gonna close this off here, share those results, and yes, we're right, present for services. So for our supportive services only or coordinated entry, it's that first service exchange when they first present for services that start date happens. To put this another way, you know, Henrietta presenting for services on May 1st, that could have been a call, right? A phone call in to entry point. And so that is, you know, making yourself available and starting those services. All right. And just as a reminder, we do have this data element available on the paper form. It's the date of data collection on our project start forms on those paper forms. So that is what it looks like. It's up at the top left-hand corner. And so if you're using paper forms, you can use that to identify the right project start date.
So Andrea, the date of data collection might not be the same date as the date of the project start date, correct?
Oh, yes. So the this is we use this on multiple forms. So on the project start form, it's the it should be the project. It should be the first date. You're saying, I think that you're saying, like for street outreach, maybe that you're collecting it over multiple days, and so maybe that wording should be changed.
Yeah, or I mean,
Good feedback.
the paper assessment. So for example, in the shelter, you know, I'm not sure when the shelter completes the intake form. Is it always the night when the person enters shelter, or might it be the next day when somebody actually meets with them to complete an intake?
Gotcha.
So,
All right. Well, we can
This is-
clarify that on
Sorry.
we can clarify that on the paper form. I think that's a good comment. That, but we want to make sure that the project start date is that date on the form, like so that you know when to enter that into HMIS. So that might be something to edit, and we can do that.
So I disagree. So we sometimes collect the data at an intake the day before someone sleeps at the shelter. The day they sleep at the shelter is their entry date.
Right.
But the data collection, it's never after they move in. It's always,
Right,
it could be before or on the exact same day. At least that's our practice. So the collection date could be different than the date they sleep here.
That's what we're looking at. That's what
And
we're
I
pointing
think-
out. And so I'm acknowledging that this should be edited so that it says project start date according to the date that we just discussed.
Probably it could be valuable, I think, as you're suggesting, Ann, to include both dates, the date of data collection and the date of the project start date. I know one of the fields in the CoC APR, or one of the tables in the APR, as well as the ESG CAPER report on the timeliness of data entry into the HMIS. So I'm not sure how that specifically is.
Yeah,
is
there's not
measured.
going to be a way to distinguish the project start date from the date of collection. So I wouldn't ask you to write that down because there's been no corresponding way to enter that into HMIS. So apologies for the mislabeling. Appreciate you pointing that out. We'll fix that. And remember what we've talked about for project start date. So,
Effort.
all right, cool. Any other questions before we talk about housing move-in date? Okay, cool. So the other thing we want to talk about, but we won't take up much time today because this only applies to a portion of folks, is housing move-in date. And housing move-in date records when a client moves in and begins to sleep in a unit supported by permanent housing projects. And this is not something that emergency shelter, transitional housing, that those folks are going to record. This is about those permanent housing projects that need to record housing move-in date. And it's really just key to remember that this is not a lease update. This is a move-in date. When does the client move in? It's also important to remember about this that, you know, for some clients, that might be a little bit of a transition, but you're going to want to use the date when they first move in. Now, when we were doing our housing inventory count and that process, it was apparent that HIC was really hard for permanent housing projects, and that there was some confusion about housing move-in date. That it wasn't quite as timely as we'd want, wasn't consistently added, and that there were some questions around when, how to record multiple move-ins if someone like loses housing and then has to be replaced. And so we wanted to break this out of our kind of regular user meeting period for all permanent housing projects, but we are asking folks to join us on June 16th at 10:30 a.m. for a virtual training. We are definitely going to follow up with agency administrators. It will be recorded, but we really want you to attend if you can. And so this is definitely for users at those rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing agencies in particular. And we've got excuse me. I just opened this instead of copying it. Cool. I'm going to copy the link here for us. And there we go. Okay. Pop that in the chat so you can RSVP, put that on the calendar. And so, yeah, we just wanted to provide some additional support for housing move-in date in particular, talk through those nuances, and make sure that we can stay up to date on those housing move-in dates moving forward.
Are you going to email that out as well?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. So in terms of looking at our calendar of what is coming up next, we did want to remind you that the Bringing It Home conference is in early June. That registration does close this Friday, so that's tomorrow. If you haven't registered yet, it's free. And we are going to have our housing move-in date training for permanent housing on June 16th, so the week after. And after that is our HMIS users meeting on the 24th. And then you can see there's not something in July and August. So we do have a little bit of a break from the federal reporting. And we do want to just give you a heads up. We'll provide more information coming soon, but want to give you a heads up that September to early October, this is when we're doing our annual privacy training requirement. And there's going to be new data standards trainings as well. So HUD is introducing new data standards, and so there's going to be some updates for that in that September time period. We're still waiting on some guidance from HUD about like how they want all of the kind of the final details around these new data standards. So just want to give you a heads up right now that that is coming, and that we'll be providing training around that time. And then right after that, when the federal fiscal year ends at the end of September, HUD has indicated that they will start the longitudinal system analysis back up. So that is our next big federal reporting season, I would say, in October.
May I ask a question?
You may.
With the new data standards, is there any kind of heads up to whether this is a new universal data element, or if it's more like new gateway questions or new responses available on sub-assessments?
Yeah.
Or like a cornucopia, like there's going to be new stuff everywhere?
It's a little bit of a combo. There's some changes to some responses. There's some language changes around race, which are welcome but don't solve all the problems with that question. There's some changes to gender. There's some program-specific changes for HOPWA and veterans VA-funded projects. I think one of the bigger changes are for permanent supportive housing projects. There's some new data elements that are going to be required. So it's not, there's not a new universal, like across project type data element. Katie, let me know if I'm forgetting one. But there are some significant changes for different project types. So we want to make sure we're getting you the info that is kind of finalized, and we have the info around what they're going to want us to do on October 1st. They're still figuring that out. So, and then the other thing is that the vendor itself hasn't shown us yet what that's going to look like. So there are some things that we need to wait on them for too. And so they're starting that process. They've had the specs for a little while now, but we don't know what that exactly looks like. So we will be providing training and materials for guidance for any of those changes alongside the annual privacy requirements. Hopefully we can condense those together so it's kind of a one checklist as opposed to multiples.
Andrea,
in the
advisory board meeting earlier this week, you referenced some changes to the assessments, dropping like the COVID assessment. I believe you referenced that happening on June 1st. You want to mention that at least in passing?
Sure. Yeah. I'm working on a kind of email blast. So the COVID questions that have been on the client profile page, we're in a new phase of the pandemic. It wasn't quite universally adopted, and so we're going to take that down. So it's not going to clutter the client profile page anymore. Yeah, so we're making a couple of changes there, trying to remove questions that are not applicable or we're not using the data for. And so we don't want you to be collecting something that isn't being utilized for, a requirement or data analysis. So the coded questions on the client profile is one of those. And then the for most projects, the county of residence, city of residence can be removed as well. There's still some requirements for entry point around residency and determining services, but we've gotten, that's not required by HUD, and we don't want to continue to have that on the assessment if it's not required, and they haven't kind of gone back to that. So we'll clean that up. And then there is going to be additional guidance around confirming current living situation for a couple of projects specifically. So to facilitate some better coordinated entry data. But we'll send an email blast about that, hopefully this afternoon. Got to put some final touches on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Lloyd. And then next month, we do want to talk, just the advisory board, what Lloyd was referencing is the governing body for our HMIS implementation across all 3 CoCs. And they have just approved, we have just approved the some strategies and priorities for the implementation for the next year. And so I want to share that with y'all next month and kind of make that mysterious body less mysterious. So we'll talk about that next time. All right. Well, I think that's all we had for prepared content today. If there are any questions or requests for troubleshooting, we can talk about that. But otherwise, please send us an email at hmis@ncceh.org. Love to get in touch and schedule time to talk if needed. So thank you so much for joining us today.
I have a question, Andrea.
Oh, yeah.
Together. If I do enter data as a particular rapid rehousing project or PSH project, where would I look to find the housing move-in date? Because I've been struggling to find that date in the client record.
In the client record, it's in the interim review. So you're going to have to go into an interim to find that date. In CAPER or APR report, it is question 22C, I believe.
Right. I see the cumulative data in those tables. The question is looking at individual records, because one of the things I do is work to track the average across the project enrollees. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. And if you want to email us in the help desk, there might be a report where it just gives you an Excel of the different housing move-in dates, so you could calculate time potentially. So let us know if you'd like some. Potentially there's a report that could help with that. Awesome. All right. Well, yeah. Thank you so much again for joining us, and I will stop recording now. Look forward to seeing you next time, June 24th.